In the years before the American bombers appeared over Europe, the name Flying Fortress carried more amusement than fear in Luftwaffe briefings. In smoky conference rooms in Berlin and on forward air bases across occupied France, German officers traded smirks as they studied grainy reconnaissance photos of the B-17. It looked, they said, like something from another era, a lumbering relic of the Great War scaled up to impossible proportions. Intelligence officers described it as a slow-moving warehouse, a four-engine brute too heavy to maneuver and too broad to evade interception. They called its multiple gun emplacements a waste of weight. And in report after report, analysts concluded that no bomber of such size and sluggishness could hope to penetrate German airspace against modern fighter opposition. The Luftwaffe had reason to be confident. Its Jagdgeschwader wings had swept the skies of Europe clean in 1940 and 1941, carving paths for blitzkrieg columns below. The Bf-109 and Fw-190 had proved again and again that speed, agility, and concentrated firepower ruled the air. A bomber that could neither outrun nor outturn its enemies seemed destined for the same fate as the lumbering British bombers that had been torn apart over the Ruhr. The B-17's own creators had touted its nickname as a badge of pride, but, to German ears, it was almost comedic. A fortress, yes, but one that would crawl across the sky, presenting itself as a perfect target. In pre-war Luftwaffe journals, analysts speculated that a handful of fighters could scatter and destroy an entire formation before it reached its objective. Even captured American press releases were fodder for ridicule. They spoke of self-defending formations, of precision daylight bombing, of crews operating as flying artillery batteries. To German strategists steeped in the doctrines of rapid interception and concentrated fighter defense, the idea was laughable. A bomber, no matter how heavily armed, was still a bomber, and a bomber was meant to be intercepted, shredded, and sent crashing in flames before it could ever drop its payload. "Let them come," one Luftwaffe colonel remarked in 1941. "We will make a lesson of their arrogance." On airfields near Bremen and Lille, pilots rehearsed intercept patterns that would slice through the ponderous bomber formations. They studied its known weaknesses: the large wingspan, the exposed belly, the vulnerability of its tail. They spoke of shooting it down before it could cross the Rhine, of reducing the supposed fortress to a smouldering wreck long before it saw a target. The mood was one of supreme confidence. German intelligence had noted the aircraft's long range but dismissed its strategic significance. After all, they reasoned, any force capable of reaching deep into German territory would surely suffer unsustainable losses on the way. Even those few officers who voiced caution found themselves ignored. A handful of engineers, after examining photographs of the B-17's rugged frame and redundant systems, suggested that perhaps it was designed for a kind of resilience unfamiliar to European bomber doctrine. Their warnings were brushed aside. The Reich's fighter arm was the finest in the world, they argued. No amount of armor plating or defensive gun turrets would save a slow target from coordinated interception. This arrogance extended beyond the Luftwaffe. In propaganda aimed at domestic audiences, the Nazi press mocked the American concept of strategic bombing as a clumsy and wasteful approach to war. German industry, they insisted, was too dispersed, too well defended, too hardened to be crippled from the air. The idea that a formation of American bombers could cripple the Reich's war machine was treated as fantasy. Yet beneath the bravado, a subtle unease lingered. Reports from observers who had seen B-17s in British service spoke of their remarkable range and unusual toughness. Crews described bombers returning with half their tail gone, with engines destroyed, with hundreds of bullet holes stitched across their fuselage, and still managing to land. These stories were dismissed as exaggerations, but they circulated nonetheless, whispered among pilots who wondered if the enemy's lumbering giant might prove harder to kill than they believed. By the time the first contrails of B-17 formations appeared over occupied Europe in 1942, the Luftwaffe's opinion had not changed. German commanders watched the slow, steady advance of the bombers with the same contempt they had held for years. They saw an enemy clinging to outdated ideas of air power, one that still believed a heavily armed aircraft could bully its way through defended skies. They laughed at the arrogance of daylight raids and the hubris of flying in tight formations where every bomber presented a target. But those smiles would not last. Within months, the Luftwaffe's pilots would discover that the Flying Fortress was more than just a slogan, and that behind the slow, deliberate advance of those bombers was a strategic doctrine that would transform the air war over Europe. The mockery, once so loud, would fade into silence, replaced by something the Luftwaffe had not felt before: respect. Long before the first Flying Fortress crossed the English Channel, a very different vision was taking shape in American minds, one that would challenge everything the old European air doctrines had assumed about bombing. In the mid-1930s, as Germany and Britain continued to refine their fighters and twin-engine medium bombers, U.S. Army Air Corps strategists were pursuing a far more ambitious idea. They believed that a single aircraft, properly designed and correctly employed, could bypass the bloody stalemates of trench warfare and deliver decisive blows directly to the enemy's heartland. It would not creep through the night like the RAF's bombers, or rely on mass formations of fragile aircraft like those seen in the Great War. It would be a fortress in the sky, capable of flying thousands of miles at high altitude, shrugging off enemy fire and striking with surgical precision at the machinery of war itself. The idea was bold, almost heretical, in a military world still dominated by battleships and ground armies. But American planners were thinking on a continental scale. They studied industrial geography, logistics chains, and transportation hubs, and concluded that wars would be decided not just by armies in the field, but by the ability to sustain those armies with fuel, steel, locomotives, and electricity. If a bomber could reach those targets deep inside enemy territory and destroy them, without the need for costly invasions, it could cripple an opponent's war effort before their armies ever saw battle. For that to happen, the bomber would need extraordinary capabilities: range to cross oceans and continents, altitude to fly above most defenses, and resilience to survive even the most determined interception attempts. The result of that thinking was the Boeing B-17. Every element of its design reflected the philosophy of strategic air power. Its 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines gave it a range of more than 2,000 miles, enough to strike targets deep in Germany from bases in Britain. Its ceiling, over 30,000 feet, placed it above much of the flak that filled lower altitudes, forcing enemy fighters to climb and lose speed before they could even engage. But its most revolutionary feature was not its altitude or speed, it was its durability. Engineers built the B-17's airframe like a flying battleship with a rugged internal structure, redundant control systems, and self-sealing fuel tanks, designed to keep the bomber flying even after sustaining heavy damage. Defensive firepower was the second pillar of the design. Where previous bombers had carried a few machine guns as an afterthought, the B-17 bristled with them, in powered turrets on its nose, tail, belly, and dorsal spine, in waist positions along its fuselage, and in cheek mounts beside the cockpit. Up to 13 50-caliber Browning machine guns formed a defensive ring that could lay down a curtain of fire in every direction. It was an audacious concept, a bomber that would not flee from fighters but fight them, holding its own long enough to press on to the target and back again. The third piece of the strategy was formation doctrine. U.S. Army Air Force's planners knew that even the most heavily armed bomber was vulnerable when flying alone, so they devised the combat box, a precise arrangement of multiple aircraft that allowed overlapping fields of fire. A single formation could cover its own blind spots, turning a group of bombers into a moving fortress wall that no single fighter could penetrate without facing concentrated fire from dozens of machine guns. It was a concept born from mathematics and gunnery tables, tested endlessly in drills over American skies before a single mission was flown over Europe. Critics, even within the US military, questioned the wisdom of daylight bombing. Night missions, they argued, were safer. But advocates of the B-17 insisted that precision required visibility. They envisioned their bombers not as blunt instruments scattering bombs over cities, but as scalpel-like weapons capable of destroying rail yards, factories, and refineries with devastating accuracy. The Norden bomb sight, a mechanical marvel of gyroscopes and optics, became the heart of that vision, allowing bombardiers to calculate release points with unprecedented precision from high altitude. When the first B-17s rolled off the production line, they embodied more than just steel and aluminum. They carried within them a new theory of warfare, one that saw air power not as support for armies, but as a strategic weapon in its own right. Every rivet, every gun turret, every square inch of armor was a piece of that doctrine. The flying fortress was not built to be beautiful or fast or graceful. It was built to endure, to punish, and to deliver decisive blows deep inside enemy territory. And while German commanders laughed at its bulk and called it obsolete before it had even flown in anger, those who had helped design it knew better. They were not building a conventional bomber, they were building a revolution in the skies, and soon the world would see exactly what that revolution could do. When the first formations of B-17s thundered across the English Channel in the summer of 1942, they carried more than bombs in their bays. They carried the weight of an untested doctrine. The crews who climbed into those aircraft were among the first to attempt what their commanders had promised was possible: daylight precision bombing deep into occupied Europe. There was a sense of cautious optimism in the airfields of East Anglia as the ground crews buttoned up the heavy bombers and the engines roared to life. Training exercises had gone well. Simulated formations had shown that overlapping fields of fire could repel enemy fighters, and planners believed that the combination of altitude, firepower, and discipline would allow the bombers to reach their targets and return home with acceptable losses. Reality was waiting for them over the continent. The Luftwaffe, far from being caught off guard, had been preparing for this very moment. Radar stations along the coast tracked the formations as they crossed into occupied territory, and within minutes, German fighters were clawing their way into the sky. The first daylight raid against rail yards and marshalling centers in Rouen in August 1942 went relatively smoothly. But as the missions pushed deeper into the Ruhr, into Lille, into the industrial heart of Germany's war machine, the fighting grew fiercer and the limits of the theory began to show. B-17 crews quickly discovered that flying in daylight meant visibility not only for their bombardiers, but for every German fighter pilot in range. Squadrons of Bf-109s and Fw-190s formed hunting packs, attacking from high altitude and diving through the bomber boxes with cannons blazing. They targeted vulnerable points: the engines, the fuel tanks, the unarmored cockpits, and then peeled away before the gunners could lock onto them. For many crews, it was the first time they had seen enemy aircraft close enough to read the markings before tracer rounds punched through the fuselage. The formations, designed to protect themselves through mutual firepower, were less impenetrable than planners had hoped. A single bomber, forced out of position, became a lonely, isolated target, and the Luftwaffe learned quickly how to exploit those gaps. Over the Ruhr, German fighter groups executed coordinated head-on attacks, a terrifying tactic that neutralized much of the bombers' defensive advantage and inflicted heavy casualties. Some formations returned with aircraft missing entire tail sections. Others came back with empty spaces where planes had been just hours before. In briefing rooms back in England, intelligence officers struggled to reconcile the optimistic projections with the grim results. Loss rates were higher than expected, sometimes exceeding 20% on deep penetration missions, and the air crew's debriefs told a story that was difficult to ignore. The B-17s were tough, yes, but they were not invulnerable. Their machine guns were deadly, but they could not always fend off determined, coordinated attacks. And while the bombers did hit their targets, the cost in men and machines was mounting faster than planners had anticipated. The Luftwaffe, for its part, celebrated these early encounters as proof that their dismissive assessments had been correct. Newspapers in Berlin boasted of American arrogance humbled in daylight. Fighter aces posed beside the wreckage of downed flying fortresses, their kill tallies rising mission by mission. Commanders reported that the heavy bombers were too slow, too predictable, and too vulnerable to sustain a campaign over German territory. And in some respects, they were right. For the moment, the psychological toll on the bomber crews was immense. Missions over targets like Wilhelmshaven and Bremen became ordeals of endurance, where each minute spent in hostile airspace brought new attacks and new casualties. The sound of cannon shells tearing through metal, the sight of neighboring bombers erupting into flames, and the constant vibration of 50-caliber guns hammering away left crews shaken and exhausted. Yet even amid the losses, they began to notice something else. The bombers that did make it home often returned with astonishing damage. Holes punched through their wings, shattered control surfaces, engines shot out, and yet they still flew. These early raids were a harsh education, a trial by fire that revealed the limits of theory and the brutal realities of the European air war. The concept of daylight precision bombing was sound in principle, but in practice it was incomplete. Without long-range fighter escorts, the bombers were too vulnerable deep over enemy territory. Without adjustments to tactics, formations could be broken apart. And without overwhelming numbers, even the best crews could not overcome concentrated fighter defenses. Yet despite the blood and wreckage, there was no thought of abandoning the mission. Every sortie, even the disastrous ones, brought new lessons. Crews learned to tighten their formations, to anticipate enemy attack patterns, to coordinate their fire more effectively. Planners began to rethink how far they could push without fighter cover. And most importantly, they began to understand that the flying fortress was not a miracle weapon. It was a tool that required adaptation, sacrifice, and relentless persistence to fulfill its potential. What had begun as a bold strategic theory was being rewritten in real time over the skies of Europe, forged in fire and flak, tempered by loss, and destined to return stronger with each mission. By the winter of 1942, German pilots who had once mocked the flying fortress were learning to respect a new and deadly reality. The B-17 was no helpless bomber. It was a gun platform in the sky, a fortress not only in name, but in function. Every mission brought them face to face with a truth that Luftwaffe intelligence had underestimated. This aircraft did not merely drop bombs. It fought back, and it fought hard. The B-17's design placed heavy machine guns in nearly every direction a fighter could approach from. A typical crew of 10 manned up to 13 50-caliber Brownings, each capable of spewing hundreds of rounds a minute and shredding aluminum and flesh alike. From the moment a formation appeared on radar, German pilots knew that closing the distance meant flying into a storm of lead. The gunners themselves became a breed apart, their roles as vital to survival as the pilots or bombardiers. At their stations, waist windows, tail cones, ball turrets, top turrets, nose mounts, they lived in a world of vibration, smoke, and adrenaline. They had trained for this. Long hours on gunnery ranges, endless drills loading belts of ammunition, calculating lead angles, and learning to work as a coordinated defensive network. Once in combat, they were the first to spot the enemy, tiny specks in the distance growing into snarling fighters. And they were the last line of defense as those fighters closed in. For Luftwaffe pilots, the first surprise came from the density of that fire. Frontal attacks, once a standard tactic against slower bombers, became nearly suicidal. A fortress nose bristled with twin Brownings, and behind them the top turret could swivel forward to join the barrage. The result was a deadly cone of overlapping fire that could rip through a Messerschmitt before it reached firing range. Even from the sides, waist gunners covered the approaches with intersecting streams of tracers, while the ball turret, a cramped, spherical capsule slung beneath the fuselage, could rake enemy aircraft from below. Attacking from behind, once considered the safest vector, meant facing the twin stings of the tail guns, guided by a gunner who had often spent months honing his aim. It did not take long for Luftwaffe squadrons to adapt, but even new tactics carried immense risk. Head-on slashing runs, high-speed dive attacks, and vertical ambushes all exposed fighters to overlapping arcs of fire. The price of every pass was high, and the Luftwaffe began to lose experienced pilots at an unsustainable rate. Many attackers never returned from missions that, in theory, had overwhelming odds in their favor. For every bomber that went down, several German fighters were often destroyed or heavily damaged, a trade that Germany, with its shrinking pilot pool, could ill afford. And even when they succeeded in inflicting damage, the fortresses refused to die easily. Stories circulated through Luftwaffe squadrons of bombers limping back to England on 3 engines, or 2, or in some cases with one barely running. Crews returned with holes the size of doors punched through their wings, with control cables severed and patched mid-air, with tail sections hanging by twisted metal. Gunners fought on even when their positions were half destroyed, firing until their ammunition ran dry or their guns jammed from overuse. The sheer resilience of the B-17 became part of its legend. It was not uncommon for ground crews to count hundreds of bullet impacts on aircraft that had somehow made it home. To German pilots watching from their cockpits, it was demoralizing. They had been told that the bombers were easy prey, but what they faced were flying fortresses in the truest sense, bristling with teeth capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy most aircraft and relentless in their advance toward the target. The bomber crews, too, grew hardened by the experience. Gunners learned the rhythms of battle, how to lead targets, how to coordinate with one another to create overlapping kill zones. Many became aces in their own right, credited with multiple kills despite never flying a fighter. In post-mission debriefs, Luftwaffe survivors often spoke of the psychological weight of attacking B-17 formations. It was not just the danger. It was the sight of so many guns flashing at once, the hum of tracers cutting past their canopies, the knowledge that even a minor miscalculation could end in fire and twisted wreckage. Each attack demanded courage, precision, and often luck, and even then the bombers kept coming. The myth of the easy kill was dead. By early 1943, German commanders no longer spoke of the flying fortress with disdain. They spoke of it with caution and increasingly with respect. It was not invincible like no aircraft was, but it was the first bomber in aviation history that could truly defend itself, and in doing so, it transformed the dynamics of the air war. Every mission became a duel, every formation a wall of steel and gunfire that had to be broken before Germany's cities and factories could sleep, and more often than not, that wall held. The early missions over Europe taught American commanders a brutal lesson. No matter how rugged the B-17 was, or how skilled its gunners became, individual bombers flying alone were still vulnerable. The Luftwaffe's fighters could isolate them, overwhelm them, and tear them apart before they ever reached their targets. Survival depended not just on armor or firepower, but on coordination, and out of that necessity was born one of the most formidable tactics of the entire air war, the combat box. It was a concept that transformed the bomber force from a collection of individual aircraft into a single, integrated weapon system, a wall of steel and fire that could advance as one and strike as a unit. The idea was deceptively simple. Instead of flying in loose groups where gaps could form and attackers could slip through, B-17s would fly in meticulously organized formations with precise spacing and altitude differences. Each bomber's guns would cover the blind spots of its neighbors, creating a protective web of overlapping fire that no fighter could approach without entering multiple kill zones at once. It was a tactic born on the drawing board, but perfected in the unforgiving crucible of combat, where the difference between life and death was measured in meters and seconds. Training to execute these formations was rigorous and relentless. Crews drilled endlessly in the skies over England, learning to hold their positions with mathematical precision. Altitude spacing had to be exact. Too close, and there was a risk of collision. Too far, and the defensive coverage broke down. Horizontal distance had to be measured to the yard. Communication became critical, with pilots constantly adjusting throttle and trim to maintain formation despite turbulence, flak bursts, and enemy fire. Gunners coordinated their arcs of fire to ensure no angle of approach was left uncovered. It was teamwork on a scale few had experienced before, a ballet of heavy bombers where every man's survival depended on the discipline of those around him. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. Tactics that had once worked, high speed, passes, head-on assaults, coordinated slashing attacks, suddenly failed against the dense defensive walls of the combat boxes. Fighters diving toward the nose of a formation were met not by a few scattered bursts, but by a curtain of 50-caliber fire from dozens of guns converging on their path. Side attacks were met with synchronized fire from waist gunners and top turrets. Even attempts to climb above and strike from behind were often suicidal, as tail gunners and top-mounted turrets stitched the sky with lethal patterns of traces. German pilots began to speak of the formations with a mixture of frustration and respect. The bombers were no longer easy prey, but a moving fortress city, each aircraft a tower with its own fields of fire, each overlapping with the next. The psychological effect was profound. Attacking such formations required not only skill, but immense courage. Pilots who once dove confidently into bomber streams now hesitated, calculating whether the risk of being torn apart before they reached firing range was worth the attempt. Losses climbed, not just in aircraft, but in irreplaceable veteran pilots, men with hundreds of missions who suddenly found their odds of survival diminishing every time they climbed into the cockpit. The combat box also changed the character of the bombing mission for the crews inside. It was no longer about individual heroism or isolated skill. It was about collective discipline. Each crew member's actions, from the pilot maintaining perfect spacing to the gunner holding his fire until the last second, affected the survival of everyone else. There was a strange comfort in that interdependence. Crews spoke of the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves, of knowing that their guns were protecting not just their own aircraft, but the men flying beside them. Despite these advances, the skies were still deadly. Flak batteries could still tear through formations, and concentrated fighter attacks could still break through on occasion. But the difference was striking. Where once Luftwaffe pilots had been able to carve through bomber streams with alarming ease, now they were bleeding themselves against an enemy that bit back. Reports from German fighter groups began to reflect the shift. Kill ratios were narrowing. Mission success rates were dropping and confidence was eroding. Even high command began to take note, ordering changes in tactics and investing in heavier, more heavily armed aircraft to counter the increasingly dangerous bomber formations. By 1943, the sight of B-17s flying in their tight combat boxes had become one of the defining images of the air war. To German civilians on the ground, they were ominous shapes blotting out the sun, wave after wave of fortress formations advancing with implacable purpose. To the Luftwaffe, they were a problem that no conventional tactic could easily solve. And to the men inside them, they were a shield, imperfect, costly, but far stronger than anything they had before. The Flying Fortress was no longer just a name. It was a reality forged in steel and teamwork, a formation that turned the hunter into the hunted and made the sky itself a battlefield where every inch was contested by walls of lead. By the summer of 1943, the daylight bombing campaign had grown far beyond short-range raids on rail yards and submarine pens. American commanders were ready to test their strategy on a scale that would either validate the entire doctrine of strategic bombing or break it beyond repair. The targets they chose were not symbolic. They were the beating heart of Germany's war machine, the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and the aircraft factories at Regensburg. Without those components, every moving part of the Reich's military, from tank turrets to fighter engines, would grind to a halt. But striking them meant flying deeper into enemy territory than ever before, beyond the range of fighter escorts, into a gauntlet of flak, radar, and swarming interceptors. It was a gamble on which the credibility of the Flying Fortress rested. The plan was audacious. Two massive bomber forces would split mid-mission, one turning southeast toward Regensburg and the Messerschmitt production plants, the other continuing northeast to Schweinfurt. By attacking simultaneously, they hoped to overwhelm German defenses and deal a crippling blow to critical industries. Before dawn on August 17, 1943, hundreds of B-17s rolled down the runways of East Anglia and climbed into the pale summer sky. For many of the men aboard, it was the longest mission they had ever flown, and for some, it would be their last. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Radar stations picked up the bomber streams as they crossed the Dutch coast, and fighter squadrons scrambled from airfields across western Germany. Dozens of Bf-109s and Fw-190s rose to meet them, forming layers of defense along the bombers' projected routes. The first attacks came over Belgium, slashing through the formations and forcing gunners to fight furiously to keep them at bay. The bombers pushed on, battered but intact, through dense flak belts that filled the sky with black puffs of shrapnel. Crews felt the concussions rattle their teeth as fragments tore into wings and fuselages. Some aircraft spiraled away in flames, others limped on with engines trailing smoke. Yet the formations held their course. At Regensburg, the first wave broke through the defenses and delivered their bombs with devastating accuracy. The Messerschmitt factories, vital for the Luftwaffe's production of the Bf-109, were left smoldering ruins. Fires raged across the complex, assembly lines were reduced to twisted steel, and dozens of aircraft under construction were destroyed. The Regensburg group continued southward into North Africa rather than risk a return flight without escorts, while the Schweinfurt group pressed deeper into the Reich. Their ordeal was even worse. German fighters regrouped and renewed their assault with ferocity, tearing into the bombers for more than 2 hours. Ball turrets jammed, waist gunners screamed warnings, and the formations slowly disintegrated under relentless pressure. Still, they reached Schweinfurt. Bombs rained down on the city's sprawling ball-bearing plants, gutting production lines and sending shockwaves through German industry. For the first time, the Luftwaffe and German High Command saw that the Americans were willing and able to strike the Reich's industrial core in daylight and accept staggering losses to do it. Of the 376 bombers that took off that morning, 60 were shot down and more than 150 were damaged, many beyond repair. Hundreds of crewmen were killed or captured. It was one of the bloodiest days of the air war, and in the aftermath, questions rippled through Allied planning rooms. Could such losses be sustained? Could the campaign continue without fighter escort? On the German side, the tone was more complicated. There was jubilation in some quarters over the scale of American losses. Propaganda ministries trumpeted the raid as proof that the Flying Fortress could be defeated, but behind closed doors, senior commanders were less confident. The damage to Schweinfurt and Regensburg was severe, and production timelines for aircraft and precision components were thrown into chaos. The fact that hundreds of bombers had reached such deep targets and inflicted real damage despite overwhelming opposition forced a re-evaluation of the American threat. The raids revealed a grim new reality. No part of Germany was beyond reach, for the men who flew the mission, Schweinfurt and Regensburg, became a grim badge of honor. Survivors spoke of skies filled with falling aircraft, of radio channels clogged with distress calls, of bombers limping home on one engine and landing on British soil with empty fuel tanks and half their crews gone. Yet amid the devastation, there was also resolve. The Flying Fortress had proven that it could reach the Reich's industrial heartland. It had proven that even catastrophic losses could not halt the offensive. And for the first time, the Luftwaffe understood that the bombing campaign was not a temporary nuisance. It was an existential threat, one that would only grow more dangerous as America's industrial might reached full stride. The myth of invulnerability that had shielded Germany's heartland was gone, replaced by the chilling realization that the war could be lost from above. Long before the war was over, stories about the B-17's ability to survive the impossible had already become legend among both its crews and its enemies. They spread from base to base, whispered in briefing rooms and repeated in mess halls, each tale more unbelievable than the last. And yet all of them true. Ground crews grew accustomed to the sight of bombers limping back over the English coast, with parts of their airframes missing, engines silent, fuselages shredded, and yet still flying. It was a testament to a design philosophy that prioritized resilience above all else, and to the determination of the men inside who refused to abandon their missions no matter how desperate the situation became. One of the earliest and most famous stories came from a raid over Bremen in 1943. A B-17 nicknamed All-American was attacked by German fighters and struck by cannon shells that severed nearly half of its tail section. The stabilizer hung by a few twisted spars, flapping in the slipstream like a broken wing. Every calculation said the bomber should have broken apart in midair, yet the crew managed to maintain control. They dropped their bombs on target and then began the long, nerve-shredding flight back across the North Sea, holding their breath with every gust of wind. Against all odds, they reached their base in North Africa and landed safely, the crippled tail still clinging stubbornly to the fuselage. Photographs of the wrecked aircraft circulated among air crews, proof that the fortress could survive damage that would have destroyed any other plane in the sky. Such stories were not isolated. Over the Ruhr, a bomber called Delta Rebel returned with a hole the size of a truck ripped through its right wing by a flak burst. One of its engines was gone, another was coughing black smoke, and the radio was dead. 2 gunners were wounded, and the oxygen system had failed. Yet the crew pressed on, guided by dead reckoning and luck, and managed to limp back across the channel. In another case, a fortress came home with more than 600 bullet holes counted in its fuselage and wings, and still landed under its own power. There were bombers that returned with their noses blown off, pilots navigating through the freezing slipstream, aircraft that landed with landing gear destroyed, sliding across the runway in a shower of sparks, and crews who bailed out of sections of their plane mid-air while the rest of it somehow kept flying, the Luftwaffe noticed. Interrogations of captured German pilots revealed growing frustration and disbelief. They spoke of fighters emptying their magazines into a single bomber, watching engines explode, wings tear apart, control surfaces disintegrate, and yet the aircraft would not go down. Many described bombers they had written off as certain kills, only to see them later in reconnaissance photos, back on the flight line, patched up and ready for another mission. Luftwaffe intelligence officers compiled reports on the phenomenon, quietly acknowledging that no other aircraft in the war could absorb such punishment and remain airborne. Even the feared Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik and the rugged British Lancaster did not match the B-17's sheer ability to stay aloft when logic said it should be falling from the sky. For the crews who flew them, this toughness became a source of fierce pride and a psychological anchor in the midst of unrelenting danger. They learned to trust their aircraft in a way few pilots ever could. When flak tore through a wing, they tightened their formation and kept going. When a fighter's cannon shells blew out a section of the fuselage, they patched it with blankets and carried on. Crews came to believe, half jokingly, half seriously, that a B-17 could fly with one engine and a prayer, and sometimes it did. That faith kept them in the fight long after fear might have driven others to turn back. The reputation of the Flying Fortress as an indestructible machine had broader consequences as well. German civilians, who had once watched bombers disintegrate under flak fire, now saw crippled aircraft limping overhead again and again, delivering their bombs and departing. It sent a message that was hard to ignore. America's air campaign would not be stopped by attrition alone. Every time a damaged B-17 returned to its base and was patched up for another mission, it was another reminder to the Luftwaffe that they faced not just men and machines, but an industrial and strategic momentum that seemed impossible to halt. By 1944, the stories of miraculous survivals were so common that they no longer shocked anyone. They were part of the mythos of the bomber crews, part of the identity of the 8th Air Force itself. The B-17 was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of endurance, of a nation's capacity to absorb punishment and keep fighting. And for the German commanders, who once dismissed it as a slow, lumbering target, the sight of those scarred, battle-torn aircraft limping home was a sobering reminder that they had underestimated the enemy. The fortress would not die easily, and as long as it kept flying, the war in the skies would never truly be under their control. By the time the B-17 campaign reached its brutal peak in late 1943 and early 1944, the Luftwaffe understood that the standard methods of interception were no longer enough. The early arrogance, the belief that the Flying Fortress would fall easily, had evaporated in the face of mounting losses and stubborn bomber formations that continued to hammer Germany's industrial heartland despite everything thrown at them. The gunners' deadly aim, the combat box formations, and the sheer toughness of the bombers were taking a heavy toll on German fighter units. For every bomber shot down, the Luftwaffe was losing multiple fighters, many of them flown by veterans who could not be replaced. If the air war was to be won, the tactics had to change. The new approach was born from desperation as much as innovation. Commanders began organizing specialized units known as Sturmgruppen, heavily armed attack wings designed to smash through bomber formations by brute force. These FW-190A8R8 Sturmböcke, as they were nicknamed, were stripped of unnecessary weight and fitted with extra armor plating to withstand the storm of defensive fire. They carried heavier weapons, including 20mm and 30mm of cannons, capable of tearing a B-17 apart with a few hits. The pilots were trained for close-range attacks, often getting within a few hundred yards, almost point-blank range, before opening fire. It was a terrifying job. Many were told to expect they might not survive their first few missions, yet the prospect of striking back against the relentless bomber streams drove them forward. Other innovations followed. German engineers developed upward-firing autocannons, known as Schräge Musik, mounted at oblique angles in night fighters and adapted for day use in some interceptors. These allowed pilots to approach from below and behind, an angle where the B-17's defensive guns were weakest, and fire directly into their vulnerable underbellies without being seen. At the same time, experienced aces refined the deadly tactic of head-on slashing runs. Approaching from 12 o'clock high, they minimized their exposure time while maximizing the impact of their cannons. The frontal attacks were perilous. A matter of seconds separated success from annihilation, but they often inflicted devastating damage when executed properly. For a time, these new tactics achieved results. Bombers that once shrugged off attacks now exploded in mid-air or disintegrated under concentrated cannon fire. Combat reports from American crews described harrowing encounters. Armored FW-190s flying straight into formation fire without flinching, then raking bombers with 30mm shells that ripped through engines and detonated fuel tanks. Entire aircraft vanished in flashes of orange and black, leaving only twisted fragments tumbling through the sky. Crews spoke of attacks from below they never saw coming, of sudden explosions that turned formation mates into falling wreckage. But even as the Luftwaffe adapted, the scale of the challenge continued to grow. The bomber streams were no longer small groups of a few dozen aircraft. They now numbered in the hundreds, sometimes stretching for miles across the sky. The sheer volume of fire pouring from these formations made even the most daring tactics costly. Sturmgruppen pilots often did not survive their missions. The extra armor made their aircraft sluggish and vulnerable to escorting fighters, while the short-range, close-in attacks placed them directly in the heart of the bombers' defensive zones. Even successful strikes often ended with the attacker engulfed in retaliatory fire. Moreover, the Allied production machine ensured that every bomber shot down was quickly replaced. For every B-17 destroyed over Bremen or Stuttgart, another 2 rolled off American assembly lines. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was bleeding pilots faster than it could train them. Each mission meant losing more irreplaceable veterans, each victory costing dearly in aircraft and lives. And with every passing month, the bomber raids grew larger and more coordinated, supported increasingly by long-range escorts that further tilted the balance against German defenders. Still, the Luftwaffe did not give up. They experimented with rocket-propelled interceptors, ground-based radar coordination, and massed formations designed to hit bomber streams simultaneously from multiple angles. None of it changed the fundamental equation. The bomber offensive was relentless, its momentum driven not only by strategy, but by the industrial capacity behind it. Even the most daring German tactics could only slow the tide, not stop it. The skies over Germany became a deadly chessboard where every move brought only temporary respite. By early 1944, Luftwaffe pilots knew that every encounter with the bombers was a duel in which the odds were stacked against them. They could no longer dominate the skies with the ease of 1940 or 1941. Each mission was a battle for survival, against the firepower of the flying fortresses, against the relentless waves of replacements, against the crushing weight of American industry. And yet the bombers kept coming, black specks on the horizon growing into vast armadas that blotted out the sun. The German innovations, daring and deadly as they were, could not change the trajectory of the war. They were buying time, and time was running out. By the end of 1943, the daylight bombing campaign stood at a crossroads. The flying fortresses had proven their resilience, their firepower, and their ability to inflict strategic damage, but the cost had been staggering. The Schweinfurt and Regensburg raids had shown the limits of unescorted bombing. Too many aircraft were being lost, too many crews killed or captured. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm, though battered, still controlled the airspace over the Reich. It was a bitter reality. The bombers could reach Germany, but many would not come back. To truly break the enemy's industrial backbone, something had to change. That change arrived with a sleek, fast, long-legged fighter that would alter the course of the air war. The North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was everything the bomber crews had been praying for. Its powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it speed and climb rates that could match or exceed those of the Luftwaffe's best interceptors. Its drop tanks extended its range deep into Germany, allowing it to escort B-17 formations all the way to their targets and back. For the first time, the bombers were no longer on their own over the heart of the Reich. The Mustangs were with them, and they were deadly. Pilots flying the P-51 quickly adapted to their new role, not merely as defensive escorts, but as aggressive hunters. They ranged ahead of the bomber streams, sweeping the skies clear of German fighters before they could form up for coordinated attacks. They circled the formations, pouncing on enemy aircraft that tried to climb into firing positions. They chased, fleeing interceptors all the way back to their airfields, sometimes strafing them as they landed. The effect on the air war was immediate and profound. The Luftwaffe's last major advantage, air superiority, evaporated almost overnight. Missions that had once been death traps suddenly became survivable. The tight combat boxes, now shielded by agile escorts, were no longer easy prey. German pilots who had once picked off bombers with relative impunity found themselves under constant threat from P-51s that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Veteran aces, already stretched thin by attrition, were now being hunted and shot down in large numbers. Replacement pilots, rushed into combat with minimal training, fared even worse. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing aircraft and pilots faster than they could replace them, a death spiral from which it would never recover. With the skies increasingly under Allied control, the bombing campaign surged forward with new confidence. Raids that had once been considered too dangerous became routine. B-17s pushed deeper and deeper into the Reich, striking not just ball-bearing plants and aircraft factories, but the very arteries of Germany's war economy. Synthetic fuel refineries, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht's tanks, planes and trucks, were systematically destroyed. Rail yards and bridges, vital for moving men and materiel to the front, were reduced to twisted wreckage. City centers, once safe from daylight attack, were pounded with precision raids that left industrial districts burning and transport networks paralyzed. The psychological impact on Germany was immense. Civilians who had once drawn hope from Luftwaffe radio bulletins now watched helplessly as waves of bombers flew overhead, unchallenged, escorted by fighters that swarmed like hornets around them. The once proud German air defense network was unraveling. Radar operators reported massive raids with little to offer in response. Flak crews fired blindly into the sky, while what remained of the fighter force was too small, too scattered, and too demoralized to make a difference. The bomber offensive had shifted from a costly gamble to an unstoppable tide. For the crews inside the B-17s, the difference was more than tactical. It was emotional. Missions that had once been exercises in sheer survival now carried a sense of momentum and purpose. Where once they had watched helplessly as squadron mates were torn apart by interceptors, now they saw P-51s diving to their rescue, scattering attackers before they could strike. The chatter over the radios changed too. Less fear, more confidence. They still faced flak and cold and mechanical failure, but the days of helplessly flying into the teeth of the Luftwaffe were over. By late 1944, the strategic balance in the skies above Europe had been irrevocably altered. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the continent, was a shadow of its former self. The Reich's factories burned, its fuel reserves dwindled, and its transportation networks buckled under the relentless assault. The arrival of the Mustang had done more than just protect the bombers. It had transformed them into the decisive weapon their designers had always envisioned. Now, with the skies firmly in Allied hands, the Flying Fortress could do what it was built to do: strike at the very heart of Germany's war machine, day after day, until nothing was left to fight with. And with each mission, the end of the Third Reich drew closer, carried on the wings of the bombers and the sleek escorts that now flew beside them. By 1944, the air war over Europe had transformed into something far larger and more relentless than anyone on either side had imagined in 1939. What had begun as carefully planned raids against selected targets had become a systematic campaign of annihilation, an industrial offensive waged from 25,000 feet. The B-17s were no longer just individual bombers or even squadrons. They were an airborne army, flying in vast formations that stretched across the sky from horizon to horizon. The roar of their engines was now a daily sound over the cities and factories of the Reich, a grim reminder that the enemy could reach deep into Germany's heartland whenever it chose. And every day they came back, heavier, more numerous, more determined, carrying thousands of tons of destruction in their bomb bays. The scale of the offensive was staggering. The American 8th Air Force alone could launch missions involving over 1,000 bombers, each carrying up to 4,000 pounds of explosives. Ball-bearing plants, which kept tanks rolling and aircraft flying, became prime targets. The great Schweinfurt factories, already battered in 1943, were hit again and again until their output was a fraction of what it had been. Refineries and synthetic fuel plants, essential to keeping the Wehrmacht's mechanized armies on the move, were systematically destroyed. The synthetic oil plant at Leuna, once one of the largest in the world, was reduced to rubble. Germany's vast network of rail hubs and bridges, once the arteries that fed men and material to the front, were blasted apart, creating logistical nightmares that rippled across the entire war effort. Shipyards and U-boat pens along the North Sea coast, once the pride of the Kriegsmarine, were buried under concrete splintering bomb loads. The Allies had learned how to target reinforced submarine pens with specialized ordnance, and soon even these hardened structures were no longer safe. At Hamburg, Bremen and Kiel, shipbuilding slowed to a crawl. The once feared U-boat fleet, which had terrorized Allied shipping in the Atlantic, found itself increasingly short of boats, parts and fuel. As the bombs fell, Germany's naval ambitions withered. The cumulative effect on the Luftwaffe was even more devastating. Fuel production plummeted as refinery after refinery went up in flames. Airfields became graveyards of grounded fighters, their fuel tanks empty. Pilot training programs were curtailed because there was no fuel for flight hours. Aircraft production, too, was crippled by shortages of aluminum, bearings, and other critical components. Even when planes were built, many never made it into combat. There was no fuel to fly them, no experienced pilots to man them, no infrastructure to support their missions. By the winter of 1944, the Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of Germany's military might, was fighting for its very existence. The devastation was not limited to military targets. Industrial cities that had once been symbols of German power, Essen, Cologne, Stuttgart and Munich, became ruins under the weight of relentless bombardment. The Krupp Works, the beating heart of German armaments production, was hammered repeatedly until its output was crippled. Factories producing aircraft engines, railway locomotives, ball bearings and tank components lay in twisted heaps of steel and brick. Rail yards that once moved thousands of tons of supplies daily were so badly damaged that trains sat idle for weeks, unable to deliver the goods that kept the war machine alive. The bombing campaign's relentless tempo wore down not only Germany's infrastructure but also its morale. Civilians endured nightly blackouts and the constant wail of air raid sirens, Workers trudged to factories, knowing they might be buried beneath rubble before their shifts ended. Entire neighborhoods vanished in single raids. For the Nazi leadership, the psychological pressure was immense. Speer and Goering scrambled to disperse production, moving factories underground and decentralizing operations. But the damage was already done. Every time production recovered in one place, another critical facility was destroyed elsewhere. Germany was trapped in a cycle of destruction it could not escape. Meanwhile, the Allied bombing effort only grew stronger. With new bases in liberated Italy and France, B-17s could strike from multiple directions, forcing the Luftwaffe to spread its already thin defenses even further. Long-range escorts roamed deep into German airspace, hunting down any fighter that dared challenge the bomber streams. And as Allied ground forces advanced from the west, the bombers coordinated with them, pulverizing rail junctions, troop concentrations, and bridges ahead of the front lines, turning strategic bombing into a direct weapon of battlefield support. By early 1945, the cumulative weight of fire and steel had done what no army could do alone. Germany's economy was collapsing under the relentless pounding. The tanks that rolled off assembly lines had no fuel. The fighters that left the hangars had no pilots. The trains that could carry supplies had no tracks to run on. The Reich's once vaunted war machine was coming apart, piece by piece, from the skies downward. And at the heart of that destruction, day after day, were the B-17s, thousands of them, blackening the skies, methodically dismantling the foundations of Nazi power until nothing was left standing. When the first formations of B-17s appeared over Berlin in daylight, it was more than an air raid. It was a seismic shift in the psychological landscape of the war. Until then, the capital of the Third Reich had remained largely untouchable. In the daylight hours, protected by layers of flak batteries, fighter patrols, and the sheer distance from Allied bases in England. Night raids by the RAF had become familiar, and though devastating, they were expected and could be dismissed as terror bombing. Daylight, however, was different. It was a statement. A deliberate challenge to Nazi power at its very core. For the men in the command bunkers and the civilians in the streets, the sight of flying fortresses streaming across the sky in broad daylight shattered the illusion that Berlin was beyond reach. The first major daylight raid on the city came in March 1944. The planning had been meticulous. Hundreds of B-17s took off from bases across England in the early morning darkness, forming up into massive combat boxes as the sun climbed higher. Long-range escorts, P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts joined them as they crossed into German airspace, their presence a promise that this mission would not end in the catastrophic losses of previous deep strikes. As the bomber streams approached Berlin, they stretched for miles, a living symbol of industrial power and logistical mastery. German radar stations detected the formations hours in advance, but the sheer scale of the force left Luftwaffe controllers scrambling to organize a defense. The defenders threw everything they had into the sky. Flak batteries around the capital opened fire with a ferocity rarely seen before, filling the air with deadly bursts of shrapnel. Fighter groups scrambled from every available airfield, climbing desperately to intercept the bombers before they reached the city. Yet the tide had already turned. The once feared Luftwaffe was a shell of its former self, its ranks thinned by months of attrition and fuel shortages. Veteran pilots were gone, replaced by young men with barely a few dozen of flight hours. They dove into the bomber streams bravely, but they were met by swarms of escort fighters and walls of defensive fire. Many never returned, and still the bombers came. Wave after wave of B-17s roared overhead, each carrying its deadly cargo of high explosives and incendiaries. Their targets were chosen with surgical precision: rail yards, aircraft assembly plants, communications hubs, and government ministries. The industrial districts of Berlin, once the engine of the German war machine, were reduced to smoking ruins. Factories that produced aircraft engines, armored vehicles, and electronics for the Wehrmacht were obliterated in hours. Rail lines that carried troops and supplies to the Eastern Front were torn apart. Even the ministries that coordinated the war effort were not spared, their grand facades collapsing under the weight of thousands of bombs. For the civilians below, the raids were apocalyptic. Streets vanished under carpets of fire and debris. Entire neighborhoods were leveled in a single morning. The sky turned black with smoke as oil depots ignited, sending pillars of flame hundreds of feet into the air. Survivors described the sound as something beyond human comprehension, a rolling, endless thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. For many Berliners, it was the first time they truly understood that the war could reach them personally, that the might of the Reich could no longer shield them from destruction. Even hardened military commanders were shaken by what they saw. From flak towers and air defense headquarters, they watched in disbelief as the bombers pressed on through the storm of steel and fire, unrelenting and unstoppable. The sight of so many aircraft, hundreds upon hundreds, flying in disciplined formations over the very heart of the Nazi Empire was a blow not just to their defenses, but to their morale. It was a physical demonstration of Allied superiority, an unmistakable message that Germany was losing control of the skies, and, with it, the war itself. The raids on Berlin continued for months, each one hammering another nail into the coffin of the Reich's war effort. Government ministries were forced to relocate, rail traffic became chaotic, and production schedules collapsed under the weight of repeated strikes. Propaganda broadcasts tried to minimize the damage, but the truth was impossible to hide. The capital of the Third Reich was burning, and there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do to stop it. For the crews of the B-17s, the missions over Berlin were some of the most dangerous of the war. Flak was intense, losses were still high, and the psychological weight of striking the enemy's capital was immense. Yet each mission carried a deeper significance. Every bomb dropped over Berlin was more than a blow against industry or infrastructure. It was a symbolic assault on the heart of Nazi power. The myth of invincibility that had sustained the German regime was crumbling piece by piece under the weight of the Flying Fortress's relentless campaign. And as the fires burned brighter over Berlin, one truth became undeniable. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The enemy's capital was under siege from the skies, and its fall, like that of the regime itself, was now only a matter of time. By 1944, the sound of approaching bombers had become part of daily life in Germany, a low, distant rumble that grew into a shuddering roar and ended in sirens, explosions, and the hiss of collapsing buildings. But what had once been regarded with defiance was now greeted with dread. The B-17 was no longer just a weapon of destruction. It had become a symbol of inevitability, a physical manifestation of a war Germany could no longer hope to win. Even before the bombs fell, the sight of those massive formations carving contrails across the sky was enough to sap morale and shake the faith of a nation once convinced of its own invincibility. Civilians who had once listened to Goebbels' propaganda about the Reich's impregnable defenses began to lose faith as they watched entire cities vanish beneath the weight of the Allied air campaign. People learned to read the sky, the faint silver glints on the horizon that meant they had minutes to seek shelter, the sudden hush of birds before the sirens wailed. Families who had once gone about their days with stoic discipline now lived in a state of permanent anxiety, belongings packed and ready by the door in case their homes ceased to exist before nightfall. Children stopped crying when the sirens sounded because they were too used to the routine of rushing underground, clutching. Gas masks and prayer books, air raid shelters, once places of refuge, became chambers of despair, where people whispered about how much longer Germany could endure. The psychological effect extended far beyond the civilian population. German soldiers returning from the front. Lines found their home cities unrecognizable. Factories flattened, railway stations obliterated, and streets reduced to rubble. They had fought in the belief that Germany's industrial heartland would continue to support them. But now they saw that heartland disintegrating under the relentless pounding from above. Letters from home spoke of sleepless nights, food shortages, and neighborhoods wiped off the map. The idea of victory, once an unquestionable certainty, now felt like a fading illusion. Soldiers began to ask themselves uncomfortable questions. How could Germany win if the factories that built its weapons no longer existed? How could they fight without fuel, without trains to deliver supplies, without cities capable of sustaining war? Even within the Nazi hierarchy, cracks began to show. Party officials, once masters of bombastic speeches about a 1,000-year Reich, now held meetings in underground bunkers and relocated ministries to remote towns to escape the devastation. Some quietly admitted that the war was lost, even as they continued to issue orders and deliver propaganda. Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, warned Hitler repeatedly that the air war was crippling production and that there was no way to replace the losses. The Führer dismissed such talk as defeatism, but even he could not ignore the daily reports detailing the destruction of vital industries. The bomber streams overhead were not just a tactical problem. They were a constant reminder that Germany's enemies could reach into the very heart of its territory at will. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the nation, now contributed to the psychological collapse simply by its absence. In the early years of the war, German civilians had drawn strength from the sight of fighters climbing to meet incoming bombers. But by late 1944, the sky above most cities was empty of defenders. The P-51 Mustangs that escorted the B-17s swept the Luftwaffe aside, often before they could even reach the bomber formations. The knowledge that there was no one left to protect them eroded public confidence even further. When people looked up and saw the bombers flying unchallenged, it was not just fear they felt, it was resignation. For the crews of the B-17s, this psychological dimension was as real as the physical destruction they inflicted. They saw it in the way anti-aircraft fire weakened over time, in the slower response of enemy fighters, in the way the cities below seemed more broken with every mission. They knew that every raid was not just demolishing buildings, but dismantling Germany's will to fight. The impact of the bombing campaign could not be measured solely in tons of explosives or square miles of wreckage. It was measured in the growing hopelessness that crept into every aspect of German life, in the mothers who stopped believing their sons would come home, in the soldiers who no longer thought victory was possible, in the officials who privately wondered how much longer they could delay the inevitable. By the end of 1944, the B-17 had become more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of a nation's industrial might and its unyielding resolve. It was a daily reminder that America could build faster, fly farther, and strike harder than Germany could ever hope to match. And perhaps most devastating of all, it was proof that the Reich's promises of invincibility had been hollow from the start. Where once the bombers had been mocked as clumsy giants, now they were feared as harbingers of defeat. Their roar over the cities of Germany was not just the sound of bombs falling, it was the sound of a nation's morale breaking. By the later years of the war, the same aircraft that German commanders had once dismissed as a clumsy, overbuilt curiosity was being treated with the same seriousness as a captured enemy codebook. The B-17, once mocked in Luftwaffe intelligence briefings, was now dissected piece by piece in hangars and workshops across the Reich. Downed bombers that had crash-landed in occupied territory or been forced down by fighters were hauled to testing facilities, where teams of engineers, metallurgists, and strategists pored over every rivet, every cable, every square inch of its skin. What they found shocked them. Not because it revealed some hidden technological secret, but because it revealed how thoroughly they had underestimated the American approach to war. The first thing that struck the German engineers was the ruggedness of the aircraft's construction. The B-17's internal structure was over-engineered by their standards, with multiple load-bearing spars, redundant systems, and reinforced joints designed to keep the plane flying, even when large sections were destroyed. Where German bombers were often optimized for speed and payload, the B-17 was built like a machine that expected to be shot at and damaged and still return home. Engineers studying recovered wrecks marveled at the self-sealing fuel tanks that had prevented catastrophic fires even after direct hits, and at the network of hydraulic and control redundancies that allowed pilots to maintain control with half their systems gone. It was, as one German report phrased it, an aircraft built not merely to fly, but to survive. The defensive armament also drew intense scrutiny. The sheer number and strategic placement of the 50-caliber machine guns represented a completely different philosophy from German bomber design. Whereas the Luftwaffe had largely accepted that bombers would rely on fighter escorts for protection, the Americans had built an aircraft that could, in theory, fight its own battles. The interlocking fields of fire, the powered turrets, the ball turret beneath the fuselage, all of it showed a level of planning and foresight that impressed even seasoned engineers. They noted that this emphasis on self-defense, combined with the disciplined formation tactics, had transformed bomber groups into airborne fortresses that could repel attackers far more effectively than expected. But perhaps even more impressive than the aircraft itself was what it represented. The sheer number of B-17s that continued to appear over Germany, despite losses, despite the vast distances involved, spoke to an industrial machine that the Third Reich simply could not match. German strategists who studied, captured manufacturing, data and intelligence reports began to grasp the scale of American mass production. Factories in Seattle, Long Beach, and Tulsa were turning out bombers by the thousands, often faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Components were standardized and interchangeable, assembly lines optimized for efficiency, and logistics systems so vast that even the loss of hundreds of bombers in a single month barely registered as a strategic setback. This realization extended beyond engineering. Luftwaffe strategists began to examine the broader doctrine behind the flying fortress, the concept of strategic bombing as a war-winning tool, the belief that industry, infrastructure, and logistics were as much a target as armies and fleets. It was a doctrine that Germany had dismissed in the early years of the war, focusing instead on tactical air support and rapid offensive strikes. Now, with their cities in ruins and their industry in tatters, many within the Luftwaffe admitted, privately, that they had miscalculated. The Americans had built a weapon designed not for immediate battlefield support, but for long-term strategic strangulation. And it was working. Even individual elements of the bomber's technology found their way into German designs. Insights gleaned from captured Norden bomb sites influenced developments in optical targeting systems. The placement of defensive gun positions informed discussions about how future Luftwaffe bombers might better protect themselves. Engineers studying the B-17's airframe durability drew lessons that would later influence designs for Germany's post-war civilian and military aircraft. What had once been scorned as heavy and inefficient was now regarded as an elegant solution to the brutal realities of total war. There was, in all of this, an undercurrent of reluctant admiration. In private conversations and technical reports, German officers who had once mocked the flying barn began to speak of it with respect. They acknowledged its resilience, its ingenuity, and the doctrine that had given birth to it. Even frontline pilots, many of whom had spent years risking their lives to bring B-17s down, admitted that they had never faced a more formidable adversary. The bomber that had once been a punchline in Luftwaffe intelligence briefings was now studied as a masterpiece of engineering, not perfect, but brilliantly suited to the task it had been built for. By the war's final months, that respect had hardened into something deeper, a recognition that the B-17 was not merely an aircraft, but a symbol of an entirely different way of waging war. It represented industrial depth, technological foresight, and a willingness to build for endurance rather than elegance. And as Germany's own air force dwindled and its cities continued to burn, that symbol loomed larger with each passing day. The lesson was clear. The future of air power would belong not to the fastest or the most agile, but to the strongest, the most reliable, and the most relentless, the very qualities embodied by the bomber they had once mocked. By the opening months of 1945, the Luftwaffe, once the spear point of Nazi conquest and the envy of the world, was little more than a ghost of its former self. The relentless pounding from above had done what no army could accomplish on the ground. It had strangled Germany's ability to fight. The destruction did not come all at once, but piece by piece, in a slow and methodical campaign of annihilation that unfolded over years. The B-17 formations, which the Luftwaffe had once laughed off as slow-moving targets, had become the architects of that destruction. Their bombs had reduced factories to ruins, severed supply chains, crippled transportation networks, and left the Air Force gasping for the most basic resources it needed to survive. The most decisive blow fell on Germany's fuel supply. Synthetic oil plants, once scattered across the Reich and vital to powering everything from tanks and trucks to aircraft, had been relentlessly targeted. By late 1944, many were producing only a fraction of their pre-war output. Luftwaffe squadrons that had once launched hundreds of fighters to meet incoming bomber streams could now barely scrape together a handful of aircraft for a sortie. Training flights, once routine, were cancelled because there was no fuel to spare. Even veteran pilots were forced to ration their flight hours, while new recruits, boys barely out of school, were sent into combat with less than a dozen hours in the cockpit. The Luftwaffe's great advantage, the skill and experience of its aviators, was vanishing as quickly as the fuel that once powered their machines. The bomber offensive also decimated the industrial backbone of German aircraft production. Assembly plants that had churned out Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs by the hundreds were now twisted skeletons of steel and concrete. Precision machining centers, ball-bearing factories, and engine works, the lifeblood of aircraft construction, lay in smoking ruins. Even when factories managed to produce airframes, they often lacked engines, avionics, or landing gear. Some aircraft were completed but sat useless on the tarmac, their tanks empty and their pilots untrained. The Luftwaffe's once formidable arsenal was being dismantled before it ever left the ground. Even more devastating was the collapse of logistics and transportation. The strategic bombing campaign had torn apart Germany's rail network, destroyed bridges, and crippled marshalling yards. Trains carrying vital supplies could no longer reach airfields or frontline units. Spare parts languished in warehouses. Hundreds of miles away, fuel shipments were stranded, and replacement aircraft were trapped behind destroyed rail lines. It was a logistical paralysis from which there was no recovery. The Luftwaffe was now fighting two wars, one against the Allied bombers and another against the collapse of the infrastructure that once sustained it, and it was losing both. By early 1945, the once mighty fighter wings that had dominated the skies over Europe had dwindled to a fraction of their former strength. Squadrons that had once fielded 40 or 50 aircraft now struggled to put up 5 or 6. Some airfields became little more than graveyards for grounded planes, their wings coated in snow and dust, their engines silent. Others were abandoned altogether, their runways cratered by bombs, their hangars flattened. Even when German pilots managed to get airborne, they were often hopelessly outmatched. Allied bombers now flew with heavy fighter escorts that swept the skies clear of opposition, and the few Luftwaffe planes that rose to challenge them were hunted down and destroyed before they could inflict any serious damage. For those who had once placed their faith in the Luftwaffe, the change was heartbreaking and humiliating. The Air Force that had terrorized Poland and France, that had rained death on London and Stalingrad, was gone. In its place was a scattered, exhausted force that could do little more than watch as enemy aircraft roamed the skies unopposed. In the city after city, people looked up and saw the same sight, vast formations of B-17s and their escorts flying high and unchallenged, bombing at will. The roar of the bombers had once been a call to arms for the Luftwaffe. Now it was the sound of their impotence. For German commanders, the realization was grim and undeniable. The air war was lost, and with it, the war itself. Without air superiority, the Wehrmacht could not maneuver effectively. Without fuel, its tanks could not advance. Without aircraft, its cities were defenseless. The once proud Luftwaffe, the force that had pioneered blitzkrieg, rewritten the rules of modern warfare, and promised to keep the Reich safe from aerial attack, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. It had been starved, dismantled, and ultimately destroyed not by a single decisive battle, but by thousands of relentless sorties, each one hammering another nail into its coffin. And at the center of it all was the aircraft they had once scorned. The Flying Fortress had lived up to its name, and more. It had not just survived the Luftwaffe's fury, it had outlasted it, broken it, and helped bring it to its knees. By the time Allied ground forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of Germany, the skies above them were already won. The Luftwaffe was gone, its power shattered beyond repair, and the war it had once promised to dominate was being decided far above the clouds by the bombers it had once mocked. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945 and the smoking ruins of Germany stood as testimony to the cost of total war, one lesson was clear even to those who had spent years dismissing it. The era of air power had truly begun. In the quiet aftermath, far from the speeches and tribunals, many former Luftwaffe officers and Wehrmacht strategists admitted something they would never have dared to say publicly during the conflict. They had underestimated the bomber. They had dismissed the B-17 as an oversized curiosity, a slow and inefficient brute that would fall prey to fighters and flak long before it could make a difference. Yet the Flying Fortress had not only survived, it had transformed the nature of modern warfare. Its impact reached beyond the immediate destruction it caused, shaping how nations would think about power, strategy, and deterrence for generations to come. The most profound shift was conceptual. Before the Second World War, the dominant view of military strength was still grounded in armies and navies, vast formations of soldiers, fleets of battleships, tanks rolling across borders, and artillery barrages shaping the front lines. Air power, though recognized as useful, was considered auxiliary. Bombers were tools of support, meant to soften defenses or strike tactical targets ahead of advancing troops. The B-17 shattered that notion. It proved that air power could be a decisive force in its own right, capable of crippling an enemy without ever crossing its borders with ground forces. Germany's factories, oil plants, transportation networks, and communication hubs were not seized by infantry or overrun by tanks. They were obliterated from 25,000 feet, rendered useless by precision bombing and sheer industrial weight. This realization had immediate consequences. Post-war military planners in every major nation began to rethink their doctrines. The strategic bomber was no longer a supporting actor. It was the centerpiece of national power projection. Air forces, once subordinate to armies and navies, became independent branches with their own commands, budgets, and doctrines. In the United States, this shift culminated in the creation of the U.S. Air Force as a separate service in 1947, a direct acknowledgement that the lessons of the B-17 and the strategic bombing campaign could not be ignored. Other nations followed suit, reorganizing their militaries around the idea that wars would no longer be won solely by seizing territory, but by destroying the enemy's capacity to wage war at all. The B-17's influence also reshaped the way nations approached industrial policy and war planning. The United States had not just won the air war through superior aircraft, it had won it through sheer production capacity, the ability to build thousands of bombers, train tens of thousands of aircrew, and supply them with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts across oceans. Future conflicts, strategists concluded, would be determined as much in factories and assembly lines as on battlefields. Industrial capacity became a weapon in itself, and nations invested heavily in aviation infrastructure, research, and mass production capabilities, knowing that the next war would demand even more from the skies. For Germany, the lessons were bitter but instructive. Reports written by former Luftwaffe officers in Allied captivity often carried the same refrain. They had focused too narrowly on tactical air support and short-range fighters, underestimating the devastating potential of long-range strategic bombing. Some even suggested that, had Germany invested in a heavy bomber fleet of its own, the course of the war might have been different. Instead, their failure to match the Allies in strategic air power left them vulnerable to a campaign that systematically dismantled their ability to fight, no matter how bravely their soldiers fought on the ground. The legacy of the Flying Fortress lived on long after the last B-17s were retired. Its influence could be seen in the development of the B-29 Superfortress, the British Avro Lincoln, and eventually the Cold War's iconic bombers, the B-52 Stratofortress and the Soviet Tu-95. These aircraft were not merely weapons, they were embodiments of a doctrine born in the skies over Germany, a doctrine that placed strategic bombing at the heart of deterrence and warfighting. They were built not just to deliver destruction, but to project power on a global scale, to make adversaries think twice before waging war. In the end, the B-17 was more than a bomber. It was a catalyst that changed how the world understood war. It demonstrated that the industrial heart of a nation could be reached and destroyed from the air, that the will of a people could be eroded by the persistent presence of enemy bombers, and that the outcome of a conflict could be determined far above the battlefields and oceans where soldiers and sailors fought. What began as a machine mocked by German officers as a lumbering target ended as a symbol of the future. A future in which dominance would be measured not just by armies and navies, but by the ability to command the skies and rain industrial strength upon the enemy from above. The Flying Fortress did not just help end a war, it ushered in a new age of warfare, one that still defines global strategy to this day.